Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm David Carter, Head of Litigation and Regulatory Policy for Postscript, and also President and CEO of the E-commerce Innovation Alliance. Thank you so much for joining us for this important discussion today. We're very happy to be able to bring this conversation to you in a timely manner and to have Ned Steiner join us for this discussion. Just a couple of housekeeping matters before we get started. The session today was advertised broadly and is open to anyone that's interested in joining. So please keep that in mind as you post or ask questions throughout the conversation today. We do have chat and Q&A open for people to provide questions as we go through the topics. Ned will lead us through a discussion of a number of areas. And so if you have questions, please put them into the chat or the Q&A. We'll be monitoring that. We'll probably incorporate some of the questions into the discussion, and we'll hold others to the end as we have time. Finally, you should see in chat a link to resources. So if you are interested in reading some of the notice of proposed rulemakings or the executive orders that will be discussed during the conversation today, those are available to you as well. With that, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm very pleased to have Ned Steiner join us today. He's Senior Director of International Trade and Government Relations at the firm Sandler, Travis, and Rosenberg, based in Washington, D.C. And I won't bore you too much with his long history of working in trade, but I will highlight just a couple of things. He worked early in his career at the World Bank and the U.S. Agency for International Development, and then spent time on Capitol Hill working with two Congress members on trade and policy issues related to that before going into private practice to work on these issues. And he has represented and worked with a slew of e-commerce companies on these types of issues, really thought deeply about how trade and trade policy impact e-commerce companies uniquely. So I'm so pleased that he could join us for the conversation today. We're going to go ahead and launch some slides that will guide our conversation, and I will hand it over to Ned to get us started.
Thank you so much, David, and thank you to the E-commerce Innovation Alliance and to Postscript. Really appreciate the invitation to speak with everyone today. I guess we'll get the slides started, and before we do, I guess maybe just a buyer beware, a warning label on the top of this presentation, which is, everybody is hearing a lot of different news coming out of the White House, coming out of the press rooms, coming out of social media. And I would advise people, my first advisory would be to just not jump to conclusions at every single little bit of news that comes out. We don't know what's going to happen. What we do know is what has been officially published. And we can certainly report on the news, but I wouldn't make any decisions, any important decisions based on what the latest tweets or truth socials or what have you are. So I guess that's sort of an initial caveat.
Great. And Ned, we do have an audience member that's asking to confirm that we're recording this. And so just to let everyone know, we are recording it. We'll make it available after the webinar today for others that would like to come back and view the content as well.
Great. Okay, so let's get started then. Here's the overview of what I thought we could talk about today, at least as an introduction. That's a lot to cover for an introduction. But I think the Trump trade agenda is on everybody's mind, so we wanted to start with that and look at what happened on day one and what did not happen on day one, equally important. And then I think we'd step back for a moment, look at Section 321 de minimis, just clarify what it is, look at some of the pending rules from the Biden administration, taking into consideration that pending rules are now variously subject to this regulatory freeze that the Trump administration has placed on new rules and regulations. But I think it's important to look at that. And then finally, some legislation that was left pending from the 118th, which may continue to inform the discussion, particularly if Congress gets involved. And then as a coda, a little bit of news about the Mexico EMEX, Mexico import for export. So day one, it was a big day. It was a cold day. Everybody headed indoors, but that did not stop the fireworks from taking place. And we have a lot of we received a lot of news to digest, particularly in the afternoon when President Trump returned to the Oval Office and to sign a number of executive orders, and his staff put a lot of information up on the website. The fact that so many executive orders were signed and so much information was placed online is a clear indication that a lot of thought has gone into these pieces. And that's something that I want people to keep in mind is, this is not, as spontaneous or off the cuff as the president may seem. The people that are working for him are doing a lot of work in the boiler room. And so anything that the president says is necessarily translated into policy by these same people. Um, you will recall that the president said he was going to impose tariffs on day one. He didn't impose tariffs on day one, as we'll get to in a moment. But he did articulate a number of policy positions, and I think that that's kind of a good guideline. Now, of course, I could be overturned very easily in my predictions, and so I would always say that take everything that you hear from me or elsewhere with a grain of salt. But I think we are starting to see a little bit of a pattern where the president takes a position, and then that position, the nuances of that position, let's say, are articulated in official policy. So there is this America First trade agenda, as is referred to by the administration, looking at a range of actions using a range of tools, a range of authorities, a lot of different targets potentially. And we could spend a lot of time on any one of these, but just to go through them quickly, the president is focused on this issue of trade balance, particularly in goods, not necessarily services, but in goods, and reserves the right to act to rebalance that trade, which he sees as fundamentally unfair. And so maybe part of that strategy might be to have reciprocal tariffs with certain countries. Also, the possibility of new bilateral or sectoral agreements. So, a nod to potential negotiations in the positive direction, not just in the sort of enforcement stick. So, we're seeing some carrots in addition to the sticks. Revising Section 321, which we'll talk about at length later, looking at removing China's permanent normal trade relations. That would be a significant move, but that's on the table. Reviewing Section 232, tariffs on steel and aluminum. Consultation regarding the U.S.-Mexico, which was supposed to begin in July 2026, but the president has indicated that he'd like to maybe speed that up. Taking a new look at Section 301, maybe additional tariffs there, or it's also possible that there might be a discussion of an exclusion process. I know that there are a lot of companies that would like to push for that. And then finally, potentially new export controls could be in the cards.
Now, before we go on, just a question for you. You spent time on Capitol Hill. see all of these potential policies related to trade coming out of the administration, do you feel like there's any part of that agenda that's going to require Congress to be involved? Or do you feel like the current laws in place allow the administration to move forward with the policies that have been outlined?
Well, I think that in terms of negotiating sectoral agreements, I think Congress will definitely want to be involved. I think Congress wants to be involved and at the very least consulted on many, if not all, of these issues. Um, because you have Republican majorities in the House and the Senate, I think we'll see a lot of deference to the administration and Congress wanting to sort of provide an echo chamber for administration policy. Um, that said, I think there's sort of a tacit um, what Congress would think, maybe not an agreement, but an understanding that Congress goes along as long as it has some kind of a seat at the table. Um, and that is especially important and significant in the context of the budget reconciliation bill that the Congress is working on, because Congress is going to uh, these are the president's priorities that Congress is looking to pass, and Congress needs to make sure that it gets all of the votes that it needs to pass the legislation. Um, and a number of those votes, I think, are, if not contingent, then very dependent on the extent to which Congress can balance the budget while it passes this reconciliation bill. So that's a long way of saying that they're going to need pay fors in order to pass legislation. And so the administration has to work with Congress in order to figure out what those are going to be. And I think Congress may think that they don't need to explicitly call the administration to the table, that the administration will come to the table in order to pass that legislation. So it as long as that legislation is a priority for the administration, then Congress has some leverage over the administration. And I think it will continue to try to weigh in on various provisions as well. Maybe in the form initially of back channels, so as not to embarrass the administration in any way, or to suggest that there's any daylight between administration and congressional policy. All the while, you'll have the Democrats sort of throwing stones at, and so it'll be interesting to see whether any of those criticisms resonate with Republicans and make their way into the discussion. I think right now, um, Republican leadership in Congress is thinking that it will go forward with a budget reconciliation with no Democratic votes. The president, I think, is holding out hope, maybe with linking budget reconciliation with funds to support California and the recovery from the fires. Um, I don't know what kind of reaction he'll get from California members on that, but I think he still would like to see some sort of a bipartisan deal coming out of this. I don't know if that's possible, but in any case, it because there's this budget reconciliation bill, because it has tax cuts in there, because it has border funding in there, the president necessarily is paying attention to that.
Great. Thank you.
Sure. And again, happy to answer any questions, as we go along here. So in that trade agenda that it sort of summarized in the first slide, we have the Trump administration pulling out and focusing and calling out de minimis, which is significant. Now, if you look at the language, and it says shall recommend modifications as warranted, this does not this is not a deviation really in any way from where the Biden administration was, or from where Congress was, and likely continues to be. It's just a way of the current administration signaling that it wants to do something on de minimis, and that's significant because Biden, as we'll see, has already teed up some, as we said, some proposed rules, and it may be that the president and his agency heads look at that and say, yeah, that looks like kind of how we wanted to address this issue as well. So, but then they will take credit for getting it finalized. But in any case,
Just in case
yeah,
there's anyone
yeah.
listening that's not familiar with the concept of de minimis, could you give us like the 30-second version of what that is and its significance?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I think in just a couple of seconds I have a couple bullet points on that. So maybe let's get to that. As I said, the Trump administration has this regulatory freeze, um, so that might hold up the Biden's de minimis notices, but it might not. They might just go ahead with it since it probably is in line with their policy. So in terms of the let's just go forward here for a second here. So, Section 321 de minimis was created in order to avoid expense and inconvenience to the government disproportionate to the amount of revenue that would otherwise be collected. So the idea is you have a T-shirt, um, and it you know it costs um, $10. Um, is it going to be worth the time of customs to chase down that T-shirt, figure out how it's classified, figure out if it's classified correctly, and collect that duty of a buck 25 when um, that's going to equal much more in terms of administrative costs and time and resources, et cetera. So there was this idea that very low value goods could bypass, if you will, the regular customs procedure, and be treated in this way. And it was basically a cost benefit analysis. And in order to use de minimis, and this is still the case, you have to have a good that's under at $800 or less. uh, the law reads aggregate fair retail value in country of shipment, which is a little bit of an awkward construction, but um, essentially $800. However you want to identify that, and it can't be more than 800 per day, and per consignee, per ultimate consignee. Um, and it can't be, you can't take a bike and ship it different parts of the bike, each part being under $800, and then reassemble the bike. You're not supposed to use it to break up the product into multiple shipments. So this was the basic of it. I mean, the way that I sort of like to talk about it is, you're on an airplane and you're bringing something with you, and it's exempt from customs duty because it's a low dollar figure. Well, it's as if the good is on the plane, but you're not on the plane with it. And that's kind of where the concept comes from, essentially. Um, so David, I don't know if you want to go back to the other points about the Trump day one, or we continue on here.
Yeah, I think we can maybe just kind of briefly summarize the other points, but kind of and just
Okay.
move forward here on the slides.
Yeah. So the only other point was that it was significant what Trump did not do, as I referenced earlier. He had threatened to put a 25% tariff on Mexico and Canada, and a 10% tariff or more on China on day one. He did not do that. We have heard subsequently that he still has designs on putting those tariffs, uh, maybe as early as February the 1st. He's also threatened Russia with tariffs if Russia doesn't end the war with Ukraine. Again, difficult to know how committed he is to that time frame. and he wanted to do it on day one. So I think what he's saying is he still has an appetite for tariffs. He's fond of tariffs as a policy tool, but nothing has been solidified in terms of official pronouncements at on the level that that has been included on the White House website, for example, or elsewhere. So we're keeping an eye on that, and obviously, but for now we're operating with this April 1 deadline, which is when recommendations from the agency heads are supposed to come back to Trump to make a decision about tariffs. So possible February 1, but possible April 1 as well. Okay, so
So
yeah, go
just
ahead.
to summarize, we have a brief reprieve from new tariffs being enacted. We don't know if that reprieve is a week or a couple months, and then we also, it seems, don't have necessarily like a lot of clarity about whether the agencies are going to report back to the president. And if there's going to be kind of opportunity for public comment or engagement on additional potential tariffs. Is that kind of the current state of the land? A lot of uncertainty.
I would say, I mean, I think that, he's given a lot of homework to the agency heads, in particular to USTR and Commerce, with respect to these trade issues. And he has asked for these recommendations. So, I would say as soon as that came out, you have industry looking to reach out to USTR and to Commerce. You have industry looking to reach out to Congress to also get Congress to weigh in on this through those back channels that I referenced earlier. And each agency is going to respond differently. Some may say, yes, tariff, do it now. Others might say, well, okay, let's announce that this is what our intention is, but there's going to be some sort of comment process, or, as I said, exclusion process, or what have you. So it is not clear how the agencies will progress. It is clear that they have, very specific marching orders, and when he says give me recommendations, he's not saying give me recommendations on how to liberalize trade with these countries. So I think, yeah, one of the recommendations is going to be a tariff. The question will be, what does that tariff look like? What's the process? And we have we have a little bit of time, to weigh in on that process now up until April 1, of course, assuming that not everything happens on February 1, which would be um, a little defeating of the process that the president has put into place, but not out of the ordinary given the actions that the president has taken previously.
So it sounds like if there are companies, e-commerce companies on the call, or us as a trade association that wanted to try to weigh in on these issues, it would be important to move quickly to try to talk, with either U.S. Trade Representative offices, members of Congress that might be able to weigh in on this issue, or potentially to the Department of Commerce. Those are like the key areas that are potentially going to try to impact what the ultimate policy is. Is that fair?
Absolutely. And as we'll talk about in a moment, there are also some there will be some comment periods, which also complicate the timeline a little bit potentially, where we'll be able to weigh in as well.
Great. Okay, let's pick up back with the de minimis exception then, and sort of where we are with this, because I think while they're closely related, there's really two distinct kind of issues that are being addressed here. And Ned, I added this slide because it comes from the notice of proposed rulemaking that you're going to speak a little bit more about. But I thought it was it was really interesting to me as someone who has not spent my career in trade, the growth and the explosion of the de minimis exception, and particularly how important it is to e-commerce companies. And so this graph sort of represents how many packages are coming into the U.S. on an annual basis that come in accordance with this de minimis exception. And I think it is in this time period, 2015, 2017 time period, where they raised the dollar amount up to
Yeah,
the,
2015. It was the TIFTIA of 2015
so it raised the dollar amount up to the current $800 at that point. Is that right?
from 200 to 800. Yeah.
Okay. And then at the same time, we sort of see this confluence of, this is pre-pandemic, but we see the confluence already of people moving to e-commerce, online shopping, all that stuff is happening in this time period. And then the curve continues, particularly around the pandemic. And I was pretty shocked when I read that about 90% of all packages and shipments coming into the US are coming in through this de minimis exception. So while it seems insignificant, it's a huge driver of the economy. It would appear to not.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny. Like I'm not always a huge fan of customs data, because they sometimes they have a point to make, and then they find the data to make their point. It's percentage of packages or shipments. You know, um, there are more small packages,
Mhm.
right? So I mean, just saying. I mean, I'd be interested to see what the value of this, for example, how many, like, of the total value, how much of the value was represented by de minimis, or so because it's also deceiving because it's not like these packages would disappear if there weren't a de minimis. They would be funneled into um, formal or informal entry,
Mhm.
um, and so they'd have to deal with them in some other way. Um,
But would
so
the
it's
goods so but would the goods that then people are getting delivered to their house be more expensive?
Oh, I would say certainly, yes, because currently the one of the things about de minimis that I'm sure participants could address here is, you're not required to classify goods, if you use the de minimis, if you use section 321. What does that mean? That means that you don't know whether or not they're subject to 301. It's for example, if a good is coming in from China, you don't know if it's subject to 301 because you're not classifying it. As soon as you require the 10-digit number, that's going to flag whether or not it's subject to 301. And if it is, that's 25% additional tariff right there.
Right.
So the other thing is that in terms of logistics, in order to, you're going to need, um, just for the 10-digit number, you're going to need somebody to classify it. Who's going to be classifying this information? Um, there are a lot of other kind of logistics issues that go with, having to classify, or having to, be, once you classify, you get these participating government agency flags, whether it's, you're not supposed to be using section 321 if your product is subject to another agency like consumer product safety or FDA or EPA, etc. But currently, if you're not classifying the good, how do you know if it's subject to another agency? And that's actually part of customs argument. Um, and so anyway, all additional compliance would be required, and due diligence. And I, I cannot foresee, unless there's some other kind of economizing going on in a new, and maybe a new channel will open up, and then and e-commerce might be able to facilitate that. Um, but I think that, yeah, I think it will translate into higher cost. Um, and then it's a question of whether or not um, the consumer is going to be willing to pay that cost, or if they have to choose between, an imported good that has to go through all of this, and it costs X, and a domestic good that costs Y. Um, they might not. Companies might decide that they can have a source from a different place.
Mhm.
Now, obviously, there are going to be some things that just aren't made in the U.S. or too expensive in the U.S. or what have you. But I definitely think that it's going to impact on price and on demand as well.
Right.
But anyway, it is true that over 1 billion packages come into the U.S. and this increase is due to de minimis, and customs is kind of at a loss of how to deal with it, because uh, they there's a lack of information with some of these packages. They come in at different ports where they don't have the infrastructure to handle them. Um, there are a lot of things, and so I think, frankly, what they're trying to do is make de minimis look more like a formal or informal entry. Um, and then it's a question of, well, is it even worth going through de minimis if you have to jump through all these hoops? And we'll see in a minute what those hoops look like,
Right.
or may look like. Okay, so just as the previous administration was leaving office, and they had signaled this probably a month or two in advance, they put out these two proposed rules, with comments due 60 days from publication. So the Trump administration, as I had mentioned earlier, has this freeze on regulations, right? Which includes a recommendation that the agency heads consider postponing anything, um, any implementation of a new rule. So, does that affect this comment period? That's a question mark. What we've been advising clients is that, we should go ahead and draft comments anyway, because we don't know if the new administration will just go forward with the current NPRM schedule, or if it'll be delayed. So, probably better to just be prepared and draft those comments in advance. Um, the first proposed rule had created this new entry process for low value shipments requiring additional elements. And the second rule um, superseded the first rule in some ways, which I'll get into. But then it also made products that were subject to 301, 201, or 232 ineligible for in terms of using the Section 321 de minimis.
So again, just kind of translate a little bit for
Yeah,
those that don't necessarily speak trade and tariff policies.
sure.
Kind of boil that down. The second proposal, would be because the additional tariffs are imposed on China, for example, under the 301 provision, as part of trying to protect sort of national security interests and trade and things like that, that the de minimis exception would no longer be available. Like it wouldn't be an option to pursue the de minimis exception, and so
Correct.
that has again kind of like real world consequences, particularly for e-commerce companies that have been routing goods into the U.S. using the de minimis exception and then sending the packages. A number of companies, for example, creating or utilizing warehouses on the border with Mexico and shipping individual packages into the country as compared to shipping large crates of goods in and then distributing them internally. And so this proposal, if it's adopted or implemented, would essentially shut down that trade route that has existed now for many years as e-commerce companies have grown, and make it much more difficult, at least more expensive, to get goods into the U.S. through that route. Is that a fair characterization of kind of what's at issue here?
I would say so, and I think that it all sort of comes from this requirement of the 10-digit HTS. As soon as you have that, now the government's able to identify whether or not the product, if the product is origin China, or indeed origin someplace else that might have a 301 investigation associated with it, or 201 or 232. Then it is no longer eligible for 321 treatment. So, and that's kind of interesting because, you know, you, conceivably you had the option to still use 321, even though you have to pay the additional duty associated with 301. But what this second rule says that um, even if you uh, are willing to pay that duty, you are no longer eligible. And this is significant too, that the way that the rule is drafted is even if you had an exclusion, you still would not be able to use Section 321. Now, again, this is how the rule is drafted. There's the 60-day comment period opportunity that we hope will open up soon. But just this gives people a real idea of where customs is. And let's see here. Sorry, are we talking low value products imported in containers for e-commerce? We're talking. I'm guessing not containers. I mean, it depends. I think I need to understand better the supply chain that you're referring to. Section 321 is a clearance. It's actually not even an entry of sort of technically, but it allows for a clearance. Express carriers have been using it to allow for manifest clearance, where they have list of products and they present the manifest to customs and they say, look, none of these are over 800. Can we bring these in? What's happened since TIFTIA and the increase in the threshold to $800, and then there was also a rule that allowed um, for businesses to take advantage of that, not just couriers, is that people have been creating DCs on the border in Mexico or Canada and shipping individual packages and getting underneath that $800 limit. So that's really what we're talking about. So anything that if you have a DC, or you're sourcing from a DC that is shipping direct to consumer or to another warehouse, there are some that ships to a warehouse where the final consignee is indicated, but sometimes there's a step to a domestic U.S. warehouse before it goes to the final consignee. Anything that's coming in on those sort of single shipments, $800, that's what would be subject to this.
Yeah. So just to kind of again round that out, probably not. You're not talking about containers of goods coming into the U.S. You're talking about potentially containers of goods going to Mexico or Canada, and then
Right.
individual shipments being sent by FedEx, for example, to your doorstep. And so, from a consumer's perspective, you don't know necessarily that the good came from China to Canada and then to the US, but you just know it shows up on your doorstep in a FedEx, UPS, or some other type box.
All right, let's get down a little bit into the more details here. So you say, well, why is customs coming up with these new regulations? We talked about the overwhelming volume of the shipments and what customs would say is lack of actionable data. What they're suggesting is that because there's not data for these shipments, that they're particularly vulnerable to being used as conduits for fentanyl or for counterfeit goods. Difficult to show that using data, but customs makes that case, as does everybody else. and goods with forced labor. Again, you know, it, I don't trust the data that they present, but they they make their point, and unfortunately, it's sort of like, okay, prove a negative, right? And that's difficult to do. So they see it. They it's a blind spot for them. It's a blind spot for them, and a blind spot for them means that lots of bad things could happen, and we don't want that to happen.
So, Ned, let me just ask sort of a political question without getting too political about the answer, right? Which is to say, these talking points about, packages coming in, fentanyl coming from China through the Mexico border into the US, were really talking points of the Trump campaign. And yet, this notice of proposed rulemaking and the way they framed the issue very much aligns with what Trump was saying, but it was actually the Biden administration that released this notice of proposed rulemaking. Any insights, any thoughts about why in the wake
Yeah,
of
sure.
the Biden administration, they would go to the step of publishing the notice of proposed rulemaking, knowing that they weren't going to be there to implement? Like, what's the benefit, if any, for the Biden administration to have published this notice of proposed rulemaking just days before they left office?
Well, the short answer is because they said they would. But also, this is a reflection, and this is why I said I didn't think that Trump would necessarily do much different. Um, this is a reflection of a fairly strong bipartisan, bicameral consensus um, on low value shipments. Um, they've been convinced, lawmakers. We kind of went from you sort of look at the negotiation of the TPP with which was a free trade agreement between 12, 13 countries in the Pacific Rim. Um, at that point, the United States, this was right around the time of the TIFTIA, the US had increased the de minimis from 200 to 800, and they were actually lobbying other countries to increase their de minimis. They were lobbying Canada, which had like a $20 de minimis. They were lobbying Mexico. They were lobbying the EU because they saw it as a trade facilitation tool. Um, but because of a number of things happening between that time and say 2 or so years ago, the consensus had really shifted. And I could go into why I think that happened. Part of it was the increase created this whole cottage industry that you referenced earlier. Um, it was at the same time that that's something called the ACE ITDS, which is an automated commercial environment, which allowed all of these agencies to get more access to import data. And so now they wanted even more access to import data. It coincided with the fentanyl crisis. It coincided with the concern, the increased concern about forced labor, and most importantly, it coincided with customs core being, which it's a law enforcement agency, and so customs always has been looking for a green light to increase its enforcement, and this has proved a winner in terms of selling their mission to the Hill and selling it to the rest of government. And so, anytime they go to the Hill and they say, well, fentanyl could come, oh, yeah, here, take all the money you want. Kind of similar to, well, the border needs, oh, okay, well, triple the amount of border, control, the amount of border control. So, I think that that this is not unique to Biden. It's a customs product, and the customs position is very much similar to in the Biden administration as it is in Trump. I don't think Trump will have a very different position in terms of customs, he might, as far as de minimis is concerned.
Mhm.
Um, so it's this idea, and because customs is also, it's important to keep this in mind, is customs is also largely a professional law enforcement bureaucratic organization. There aren't a lot of political people inside of customs. There are a few, um, but the operational people and the policy people and the lawyers at Office of Rules and Regulations are really the ones who, for the most part, run the show. And you'll note too that the commissioner is sometimes the last person to be confirmed. It seems like maybe Trump will prioritize the commissioner of customs a little bit more, but we've had so many acting commissioners and official performing the duties of a commissioner, because you're only allowed to be acting for so long. Anyway, so that's a very long-winded way of saying that this is customs position, and that's why it doesn't look very different whether it's Biden or Trump.
Thank you. That's I think that's really helpful background for people to understand, like that. Even though this rulemaking got started, it really is conveying kind of a common approach or sense of uh, policymakers really on both sides of the aisle right now on this issue. So
Yeah.
let's knowing that we're about 12 minutes before our scheduled end, let's move forward with kind of talking a little bit more about the two notice of proposed rulemakings that will be open hopefully for comment in the near future,
Yeah.
and then kind of touch base on a couple of the other items that you have on what's happening in the House, and if we have time on that.
Sure. So this is there are these they're imagining these two processes. One is the enhanced entry process, a lot of additional data, the kind of data that came out in discussions with these two projects that Customs has been running. And if you can see there, um, the 10-digit HTS that I talked about, but also conditional data elements with the seller name and address and purchaser name, and also you want to have the product identifier, all these additional elements. As I said, many more data requirements than formal entry. And at some point, people might say, well, what's the point of doing de minimis if we have to do all this other stuff? And I think that to the extent that you are thinking about submitting comments, I think that's a very good point. This de minimis is supposed to be facilitative, and this doesn't exactly look like it's making things easier.
So Ned, sorry to you've mentioned this a couple times, and it's in the slide about this 10-digit code and this classification process. Could you give us like the 30 seconds for the uninitiated on like what is this, and what's the burden for a company or for an e-commerce company that is not doing that today? Is it costly? Are there, is it a long and tedious process? Like what does it look like in practice to go to the place of having that 10-digit classification?
So all goods need to be properly classified when entered, unless they don't require classification, like in the case of de minimis. But if you're entering a good informally or formally, um, you have to enter that good, um, and classify that good. And importers themselves are able to enter, but also importers can use a broker, and the broker can be an independent broker house. It can be a broker that works with the courier. Um, and uh, there are 97 chapters that goods are classified in. Classification is based on um, the description under the tariff number, and also there are notes, and there are rulings associated with those classifications, um, and which is one of the reasons it's a good idea to use a broker or a law firm to help you with that classification, and to confirm that classification. There's a lot of there's a lot of software out there also that helps now with classification that might help with a sort of an initial gloss, but you always want to make sure that you're using the correct classification. Something that's I think maybe not understood well is there's only one correct classification number. There's not you, there in some instances there is an open debate, a formal debate that where customs is there's a pending rule or a pending decision or something, but there's a best choice. There's a if you have two, what's the best one, and you got to choose that best one. A lot of folks started reclassifying their goods when the 301 exclusions were published because they wanted to take advantage of the exclusions. But customs, caught wind of that, and there were a number of enforcement actions because you're not supposed to change your classification just so that you can avoid duty. It's you figure out how it's classified, and then you pay whatever duty goes with that classification. Now, there aren't, I would say, there are ways to change the classification in terms of the nature of the product. There are ways of changing the country of origin based on the nature of the product and the way that production processes. I would be more than happy to talk with you and to connect you with with attorneys at the firm where I work, and we could talk about that offline. I think more and more that's going to be interesting to folks because of what's going on in the tariff world. But just to close that discussion about HTS is the definition of the product as far as customs is concerned.
That's great, and I think it's important just to kind of note that it's not just about getting the classification right, but the classification has direct bearing on what duty you're required to pay for that product.
Correct. So the duty is a quick way of thinking of it is it's a 10-digit HTS in the U.S., right? The 6-digit is governed by an international treaty convention. 8-digit is developed by the U.S. and determines tariff, and the 10-digit is for statistical purposes. Okay. So the last two numbers are to get a little bit more granularity on what the product is, but the product is dutiable at the 8-digit level.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, no, lots to talk about, So, but what I really wanted people to come away with is that there's this opportunity. To comment on these proposed rules, although we're a little bit of in a holding pattern. But I'd be happy to talk with people in greater depth about these rules. What's interesting is that the second rule does supersede the first rule in a way because it would require a 10-digit for both processes, whether it's basic or enhanced. So there's really no way to, if customs gets its way, there's no way to enter the good without the 10-digit number. There are a lot of issues that flow from that, but I think it's important to note that, and this is an opportunity for folks to weigh in, and we can talk more about what does that mean for what does that mean for e-commerce? What does that mean for people who don't have that technical expertise? I don't know what classification is. Where do I go now to get that classification? Whole series of questions and actions that flow from that. So just very briefly, I'll run through these. Is that Congress was working on this before. This is what the House proposal was, the House Republican proposal, and essentially said that 301, 201, 232 would not be eligible for de minimis. So similar to what the Biden proposed rule is. Wyden wanted even more than that. So not only 201, 301, but anything that could be sensitive, understood with the generalized system of preferences. The Democrats are kind of out of the conversation right now because it's all, Republicans have the shooting match. But just to show that the Democrats were looking for even more restrictions. So there are not a lot of folks out there who are saying, you know what, we need to make de minimis easier for people. So then finally on the Mexico front, I just wanted to say that there was this the rule that came out of Mexico, and people were very worried about it. But it turns out, and I think this is the second page, that they're not really going to change EMEX. So if you are EMEX, then you'll still be able to use the you won't be charged you'll still be able to apparel and textile and apparel will still be eligible for EMEX. There was some concern that they wouldn't be, but you need to make sure that your EMEX and your VAT certification are renewed. So they're valid from 6 months, but then they close, and so you have to make sure that they're in good standing. And that's really what you need to be focused on in terms of Mexico. And we have folks down there. I'd be happy to, again, talk offline in greater detail about what you need to be looking for.
So it sounds like, again, kind of a bit of a reprieve from Mexico side, but if the rules change here in the U.S., it'll be somewhat moot, right? Like it's not like a permanent fix just because Mexico dialed back a little bit. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, I mean, if Mexico still has, maquiladoras and there still might be some advantages to having a DC in Mexico and cost advantages and logistic advantages, etc. But that model of the DC being able to supply either direct to consumer or to domestically and then direct to consumer, that might not be available depending on what happens with this rule. And I think people need to start really working on their arguments for why de minimis should be preserved. And I would say, David, and I said this when we first started talking, is e-commerce really needs a seat at the table in these discussions. You have a lot of legacy importers, a lot of domestic industry, and they've kind of teamed up, if you will, to put the stranglehold on de minimis. And e-commerce is not getting now. There is a little bit of representation in terms of platforms. Some of the platforms participated in the pilot projects. Some of the platforms are having conversations with members, but there's no substitute for small business weighing in. And I think it's terrific that the E-commerce Innovation Alliance is here and has that mission to give a voice to e-commerce companies. And I look forward to working with all of you.
Great. Well, with that, we are at time. I wanted to thank Ned for joining us for the conversation today. Thanks all of you as well who joined us. As noted in the chat, we'll be circulating a follow-up email with video and other resources for you. And if you have any questions, we'll also include Ned's contact information so you can reach out to him directly. Again, thanks so much to all of you for joining us, and have a good rest of your day. Take care.